I am Maya, 35 years old. And until last night, my husband's elite family thought I was nothing but a glorified secretary. We were sitting at the mahogany dining table inside my in-laws' sprawling Atlanta estate when my white brother-in-law, Wyatt, smirked at me. "You are in the Navy?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Let me guess. Supply chain. I bet you have never been on a real mission." An older man at the head of the table, my father-in-law, Harrison, looked up with a sneer. "What is your call sign?" he demanded clearly, expecting me to stutter. I looked him dead in the eye and gave him one single word: Eclipse. Before I tell you how that one word shattered his crystal wine glass and unraveled their entire fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to dismantle an arrogant bully using nothing but the cold, hard truth. For the past 5 years of my marriage to Jamal, my in-laws have made it their personal mission to remind me that I do not belong in their world. Harrison and Vivian built a lucrative defense contracting firm and carry themselves like Atlanta royalty. They live in a massive gated compound where the driveway is lined with imported oaks and the interior smells like expensive bourbon and generational arrogance. To them, I was just a diversity quota, a girl from a regular working-class neighborhood who somehow tricked their investment banker son into marriage. Tonight was supposed to be a celebratory dinner for Wyatt. He is married to Jamal's younger sister, Aaliyah. Wyatt is a Navy lieutenant who works entirely behind a desk managing cargo manifests and supply routes. But the way he talks, you would think he single-handedly commands the entire Pacific Fleet. We were seated around a massive custom-built dining table. Vivian was at one end pouring vintage wine while Harrison anchored the head of the table, swirling his glass. Wyatt was holding court, loudly recounting a story about how grueling his recent deployment was. He complained about the humidity, the subpar food, and how heavily the entire base relied on his logistical genius to keep operations running. Aaliyah sat next to him, nodding proudly and flashing her oversized diamond ring. "Wyatt is just so essential to the command structure," she announced to the room, making sure to look directly at me. "It must be so intense, carrying that much responsibility. Not everyone is cut out for the real pressure of military life." I kept my face perfectly neutral and took a bite of my roasted asparagus. I had learned early in this marriage that reacting only gave them the satisfaction they craved. Jamal sat beside me silently cutting his steak. He did not say a word to defend me. He never did. Jamal was terrified of his parents and desperate for his father's approval. Whenever his family threw thinly veiled insults my way, Jamal would just look down at his plate and pretend he did not hear a thing. Wyatt caught my lack of reaction and narrowed his eyes. His fragile ego could not handle anyone being unimpressed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and directed his attention entirely to me. "You know, Maya, it is funny," Wyatt said, his voice loud enough to halt all other conversations. "You have been in the Navy for what, 8 years now, and we barely hear a peep about your work. You are a lieutenant commander, right? What is it that you actually do all day?" "Process leave requests, inventory the cafeteria snacks." Vivian let out a sharp little laugh. "Oh, Wyatt, do not tease her. Someone has to do the paperwork. It is a perfectly respectable clerical job." I placed my fork down on my porcelain plate, letting the soft clink echo in the quiet dining room. "I am an aviator," I said, my voice calm and measured. "I fly planes, Wyatt. I do not count boxes." Wyatt scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "An aviator? Sure. There are plenty of transport pilots hauling cargo from point A to point B. It is basically flying a delivery truck. But you are in the Navy. Let me guess. You have never been on a real mission. You have probably never even seen the airspace over a combat zone." The table went quiet. Aaliyah smirked, swirling her champagne. "It is okay, Maya," she chimed in. "Wyatt has seen the harsh realities of deployment. It is a completely different world from sitting at a desk on a domestic base. You do not have to pretend to be a war hero just because you wear a uniform." I looked at my husband, expecting him to intervene, to say something, anything. Jamal just took a sip of his water and avoided my gaze entirely. The betrayal stung, but it was a familiar sting. I had spent 5 years shrinking myself to fit into their shallow country club aesthetic, playing the quiet and polite wife, so Jamal would not feel emasculated. I had endured Vivian complaining that my military boots scuffed her imported marble floors and Harrison calling my career unladylike. I was done shrinking. Harrison leaned forward from the head of the table. He was a retired Navy captain, who still demanded to be addressed by his rank by the household staff. He carried his pass service like a weapon, using it to intimidate anyone who crossed his threshold. "Let us clear this up right now," Harrison said, his voice booming with patriarchal authority. "Wyatt is a decorated logistics officer who understands the theater of war. If you are actually flying combat missions, girl, you would have a call sign. Every real aviator in a combat squadron earns one. So, what is yours?" He asked the question like it was a trap. He was looking at me with a sneer, fully expecting me to stutter or make up some generic nickname that he could instantly tear apart. He wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone to solidify his absolute dominance over the family hierarchy. I picked up my linen napkin, wiped the corner of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I looked Harrison dead in the eye, holding his gaze without a single flinch. "My call sign is Eclipse," I said. The reaction was instantaneous. Harrison froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His fingers went slack, and the crystal wine glass he was holding slipped from his grip. It hit the mahogany table and shattered, sending dark red wine spilling across the polished wood and staining Vivian's pristine white table runner. Nobody moved. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of wine dripping onto the expensive rug below. Harrison knew exactly what that word meant. 3 years ago, a highly classified extraction mission in Syria had gone catastrophically wrong. A unit of elite special operators heavily tied to Harrison's former command network had been ambushed and pinned down in a rocky valley. They were taking heavy casualties and had zero chance of survival. The logistics team, Wyatt's exact department, had failed to secure a safe extraction route. The only thing that saved those men was a lone fighter pilot who defied protocol, dove into the hostile valley under heavy anti-aircraft fire, and delivered pinpoint close air support that neutralized the enemy positions. The pilot flew so low and struck so fast that the ground team later reported she blotted out the sun before dropping the payload. The military community whispered about the pilot calling her Eclipse. Her identity was heavily classified attached to the Joint Special Operations Command. She was a ghost, a highly decorated legend in the exact circles Harrison worshipped, and she was sitting at his dinner table eating roasted asparagus. Harrison's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at me, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Vivian immediately jumped up entirely, missing the gravity of the situation. "Harrison, look what you did," she shrieked, grabbing a handful of napkins and dabbing frantically at the spilled wine. "This is imported silk. You are ruining the table." She glared at me as if the spilled wine was my fault. "Honestly, Maya, look at the tension you are causing with your tall tales." Aaliyah scoffed loudly, breaking the remaining tension. "Eclipse? Really, Maya? What kind of comic book did you pull that out of? You expect us to believe that you are some top-secret fighter pilot? Wyatt, tell her how ridiculous she sounds." Wyatt was turning a deep shade of crimson, his face contorted with embarrassment and rage. He had just spent an hour bragging about inventory spreadsheets to a woman who had actively engaged in classified combat. His fragile superiority complex could not process the humiliation. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the silverware jump. "You are a liar," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are a diversity hire pushing papers at a naval base. Stolen valor is a federal offense, Maya. I know the regulations better than anyone here. Claiming a classified combat record you do not have is a crime." I remained perfectly seated. My posture relaxed, my expression completely cold. "I am reporting you to command first thing tomorrow morning," Wyatt threatened, his voice echoing through the dining room. "I am going to have you investigated, stripped of your rank, and dishonorably discharged for this. You picked the wrong family to lie to." Jamal finally found his voice, reaching out to grab my arm. "Maya just apologized," he hissed frantically. "Tell them you made it up. Stop making things worse." I slowly removed Jamal's hand from my arm, disgusted by his absolute lack of spine. I stood up from the table, smoothing down my dress. I looked at Wyatt, watching the vein bulge in his neck, and then glanced at Harrison, who was still staring at me in pale, horrified silence. I offered Wyatt a chilling, deliberate smile. "Please do," I replied. "Make the report, Wyatt. I highly encourage it." I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving them drowning in their own chaos. I had no idea that Wyatt's wounded pride would trigger a chain reaction of corporate espionage, gaslighting, and federal crimes. But they had just declared war on a woman trained to dismantle hostile threats, and I was going to destroy their entire empire. The next morning, the air on the naval base was thick with humidity and the sharp scent of aviation fuel. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the command building, my dress uniform pressed and immaculate. My boots struck the linoleum floor with a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I was not anxious. I was a pilot trained to land multi-million-dollar fighter jets on the pitching deck of an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean at night. A temper tantrum from an insecure logistics officer was not going to break my composure. I was directed immediately to the office of the base commander. Captain Sterling sat behind a heavy oak desk, surrounded by framed commendations and photos of his deployed units. He was a stern man who valued discretion above all else. He motioned for me to take the seat across from him. He did not look like a man preparing to discipline a subordinate. He looked deeply irritated. "Lieutenant Commander," he began lacing his fingers together on the desk. "First thing this morning, my office received a formal anonymous complaint regarding your conduct. The complaint alleged that you have been falsely claiming a classified combat record in social settings. The phrase stolen valor was explicitly used. I kept my posture rigid and my hands folded in my lap. I am aware, sir. My brother-in-law made the threat at a family dinner last night." Captain Sterling let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in his leather chair. "I assumed as much. Here is the problem, Maya. I am not calling you in here to investigate this absurd complaint. I am calling you in here because your security protocols were triggered at 0200 hours this morning. The system automatically flagged a major security violation." I narrowed my eyes slightly. "What kind of violation?" "Your brother-in-law is stationed at the Logistics Command Center across the base," Captain Sterling explained. "It appears he used his terminal access to try and pull your military identification number through the central database. He bypassed standard personnel files and attempted to force a query into the restricted Joint Special Operations Command Network to prove you were lying about your service record. The sheer stupidity of it almost made me laugh. Wyatt was so desperate to protect his fragile ego that he had blindly stomped into a digital minefield. When an unauthorized user attempts to access heavily classified JC personnel files, the system does not just deny them." Captain Sterling continued, his voice low and serious. "It drops a digital cage. It locks down their terminal logs, their location, and sends an immediate alert to federal cybersecurity divisions. Your brother-in-law tripped a federal security protocol because his pride was hurt." "I understand, sir," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "What are the next steps?" "The cybersecurity division has already locked Wyatt out of the network. Captain Sterling said he is currently sitting at a dead terminal. We are required to launch a formal inquiry into his unauthorized search. Because your restricted file was the target, I wanted to brief you personally. Keep your head down, Maya. This is about to get very ugly for him." I thanked the captain and left the office. Walking back to my vehicle, the morning sun felt warm on my face. Wyatt had dug his own grave. I did not even have to lift a finger. He was so deeply intimidated by a successful black woman that he had risked his entire military career just to try and put me in my place. I drove back to the upscale neighborhood where my husband Jamal and I lived. The contrast between my disciplined world on the base and the superficial status-obsessed bubble Jamal cared so much about had never been more glaring. I had spent 5 years funding half of our pristine lifestyle, paying for the mortgage on our modern home, while Jamal leased luxury cars to keep up with his father. I compromised and accommodated to make him comfortable. I was done compromising. When I walked through the front door, the house was completely silent. Then I heard the heavy, frantic pacing upstairs. Jamal came rushing down the wooden staircase, his tie loosened, and his expensive dress shirt wrinkled. He looked panicked. "What did you do?" Jamal yelled before my boots had even cleared the entryway. His face was flushed with anger. "My mother has been calling me all morning." Wyatt called Aaliyah in a complete panic. He said his computer terminal at the base was locked down by military police and he is under investigation. "What did you say to your commander?" I took off my cover and placed it carefully on the entryway table. I did not say a single word to my commander, Jamal. Wyatt did this to himself. He tried to hack into restricted special operations files to prove I was a liar. He tripped a federal security alarm. Jamal threw his hands in the air, pacing across the living room rug. "Why could you not just let him have his moment, Maya? You know how insecure he is about never seeing combat. You know, my family respects his service. You just had to show off and embarrass him in front of my father." I stared at the man I had married, feeling nothing but cold clinical detachment. Jamal was not angry that his brother-in-law had insulted my honor. He was not angry that Wyatt had committed a federal offense. He was angry that my existence had disrupted his family's carefully curated country club aesthetic. I am not responsible for managing a grown man's insecurities, I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. He insulted me. He mocked my career. And you sat there cutting your steak and let him do it. Jamal scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. You always do this. You always have to prove you are the smartest person in the room. You do not fit in with my family, Maya. You never have. You are too aggressive. My mother was right about you. You cannot handle peace. You thrive on conflict now. Wyatt might lose his job. And Aaliyah is crying hysterically. You need to fix this. You need to go back to your base and tell them to drop the investigation. I was actively gaslighting me. He was trying to twist reality to make me the aggressor and Wyatt the victim. It was a classic manipulation tactic, designed to make me doubt my own sanity. He wanted me to grovel and beg the military to ignore a federal breach, just so his mother would not be embarrassed at her next charity brunch. I am not withdrawing anything, I replied, stepping fully into the living room. Wyatt broke the law. If your family cannot handle the consequences of their arrogance, that is not my problem. Jamal stepped closer to me, pointing a finger in my face. You are going to ruin my family over a petty dinner table argument. You are paranoid, Maya. You are acting completely insane. Maybe you actually do have post-traumatic stress from whatever it is you claim you did in Syria. Maybe you need psychiatric help. The air in the room felt suddenly very thin. My husband was actively using my military service as a weapon to convince me I was mentally unstable. He was trying to break my perception of reality to protect a white man who had mocked me. Before I could formulate the exact words to end our marriage, right there on the spot, I felt a sharp, distinct vibration in my uniform pocket. It was my secure, encrypted mobile device. I did not break eye contact with Jamal. As I reached into my pocket and pulled out the phone, I glanced down at the screen. The background of the screen was flashing a silent, bright red. It was a custom alert connected directly to the private firewall on my home office network. My office was located down the hall, secured with a biometric lock. It housed my classified military laptops and physical hard drives, containing sensitive strategic data that I was authorized to review off-site. I read the text of the alert. Unauthorized access attempt detected. External drive clone initiated. Someone was currently trying to download and copy the contents of my heavily restricted military hard drive. My analytical training kicked in instantly, pushing aside the emotional pain of my crumbling marriage. I looked at the IP address attached to the digital breach. It matched our home internet router. I looked up at Jamal. He was still glaring at me, his chest heaving with manufactured anger. He was continuing his rant about how I needed to apologize to Aaliyah and how I was destroying the family peace. But his eyes kept darting nervously toward the hallway, toward my locked office. Jamal was the diversion. I was standing here screaming at me, calling me crazy, telling me I needed psychiatric help to keep my attention focused on him. He was keeping me in the living room while someone else was down the hall breaching my secure network. And there was only one other person who had a motive to steal military data today. Jamal had let Wyatt into our home. I stood in my own living room looking at the man I had promised to spend my life with. He had not just failed to defend me. He was actively participating in corporate espionage. He was helping his brother-in-law steal classified federal data from his own wife. They were trying to rob my life's work right under my nose. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. My heartbeat slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. I was no longer a wife dealing with a toxic husband. I was a military officer standing in a room with a hostile threat, and I knew exactly how to destroy them. I looked at my husband as his mouth continued to move. He was still spewing venom about how I needed to apologize to his sister and how my presence was a disruption to his perfect family. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I simply nodded, told him I needed a moment to cool down, and walked right past him. I left him standing in the middle of his own manufactured tantrum. Down the hall, the heavy oak door of my office was shut tightly. I placed my thumb on the biometric scanner. A green indicator light flashed, and the internal locking mechanism clicked open. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The room was perfectly still, bathed in the low light of the afternoon sun, filtering through the blinds, but my digital perimeter was actively bleeding. I sat down at my desk and opened my secure, encrypted laptop. I did not feel heartbreak or panic. I felt a sharp, singular focus, the kind of focus that keeps you alive when everything around you is falling apart. I pulled the local network administrative logs. The intrusion had originated from a guest device connected to our home Wi-Fi network. It was Wyatt's personal laptop. The timeline matched perfectly. Jamal had temporarily disabled the secondary motion sensors in the hallway earlier that morning, giving Wyatt exactly 14 minutes of blind access to the physical server rack mounted under my desk. Wyatt had plugged in an external hard drive and attempted to bypass the encryption using a brute force script. It was a pathetic amateur attempt. My firewall had neutralized the threat and quarantined his drive the second it connected. But the real question was why? Why would a desk jockey logistics officer risk federal prison and a court-martial just to access my files? I shifted my focus away from the military servers and targeted Jamal's devices. My husband was an investment banker. Like most arrogant men who think they are untouchable, he was incredibly lazy with his digital hygiene. His personal laptop and tablet were fully synced to our home network. I ran a quick, untraceable search through his recently accessed files and unencrypted email caches. What I found was a spectacular portrait of generational failure. Harrison, the great patriarch, the man who commanded respect at every country club dinner and held himself up as the pinnacle of black excellence, was completely broke. His private defense contracting firm was drowning in over $12 million of hidden debt. They had leveraged absolutely everything to stay afloat. The luxury cars, the gated compound, Vivian's designer wardrobe. It was all a hollow house of cards ready to collapse at any moment. I dug deeper into the synced folders. There was a specific directory on Jamal's desktop labeled Project Savior. Inside were strings of urgent internal memos between Jamal Harrison and Wyatt. The Department of Defense was currently accepting bids for a massive $40 million logistics and supply chain contract. Harrison's firm was desperate to win it. It was the only thing that could save them from total financial ruin and public humiliation. But their proprietary logistics models were outdated and terribly inefficient. They were going to lose the bid to younger, more innovative defense companies. Unless, of course, they had access to cutting-edge classified strategic templates, the exact logistical mapping templates I had designed and stored on my secure drive. The realization washed over me like ice water. Jamal was not just a coward who refused to defend his wife against his family's disrespect. He was an active participant in corporate espionage. He and his family had orchestrated the entire argument last night to put me on the defensive. They wanted me distracted, emotional, and off balance so I would not notice them plotting a federal heist in my own home. They were going to steal my life's work, slap Harrison's company logo on the cover page, and sell my strategies back to the federal government for $40 million. I needed to know exactly how far Jamal was willing to go to cover his tracks. I needed to look him in the eye and see the absolute depth of his betrayal for myself. I closed my laptop, wiped the network search logs clean, and walked back into the living room. Jamal was pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon at the bar cart. His hands were shaking slightly. He was clearly waiting for me to come back and continue the argument about his sister. I did not mention the military files. I did not mention Wyatt or the base commander. I approached him with a calculated misdirection. I told him I had just checked our joint savings account to pay the annual property tax and noticed a glaring discrepancy. I asked him about a $50,000 withdrawal transferred to a limited liability company I did not recognize. It was a shell company I had just seen in his emails, linked directly to Harrison's failing firm. I kept my voice perfectly level, presenting it as a simple household administrative question. Jamal froze. He set the heavy crystal glass down on the cart, so hard the liquor sloshed over the rim. Then, the pivot happened. The sheer speed and fluidity of his manipulation was staggering. He turned to me, and his face softened into a masterclass of fake pity. "Maya," he said, using a low, soothing voice that made my skin crawl. "There is no missing money. I think the stress of the base is getting to you again." I stood my ground and did not let him change the subject. I asked him directly why our personal savings were being funneled to his father's business without my consent. Jamal shook his head and let out a heavy dramatic sigh, acting as though he was dealing with an unruly child. "You are seeing enemies everywhere, Maya. First, you attack Wyatt at dinner out of nowhere, and now you are accusing my family of stealing from us. You are paranoid. I really think your trauma is making you hallucinate things. We need to get you a psychiatric evaluation. You are not thinking clearly." The air in the room grew heavy. My husband was actively using my military combat service as a weapon to convince me I was mentally unstable. I was trying to break my perception of reality. He was willing to destroy my sanity, my career, and my entire reputation just to cover up his financial crimes and save his father's bankrupt image. He wanted to institutionalize his own wife rather than admit he was a thief. Any lingering affection I had for the man standing in front of me evaporated in that exact second. It was replaced by a cold, metallic resolve. The betrayal was absolute and unforgivable. Jamal thought he was handling a hysterical, overly emotional woman who could be easily silenced with a little bit of gaslighting. He thought he could use my uniform against me and sweep his treason under the rug while his family laughed at me behind closed doors. He had absolutely no idea that he was dealing with an officer trained to dismantle hostile threats from the inside out. He did not know that I was already mapping out the blast radius. I looked at Jamal as he stood in our living room, perfectly dressed and completely morally bankrupt. He had just suggested I needed psychiatric help to cover up his corporate espionage. A younger, more naive version of me might have screamed. I might have thrown the crystal glasses off his bar cart or demanded an explanation for his treason. But military training overrides panic. You do not engage a hostile target when you lack a tactical advantage. You secure your perimeter and you control the narrative. I looked at him and let my shoulders drop. I softened my expression and forced my voice to sound tired and defeated. "You know, Jamal," I said quietly, "maybe you are right. Maybe the stress of the base is clouding my judgment. I need some space to clear my head." The relief on his face was immediate and sickening. He thought his gaslighting had worked. He thought he had successfully convinced a highly decorated combat aviator that she was losing her mind. I told him I was going to pack a bag and stay at the temporary officer housing on base for a few days to decompress. I walked upstairs to our bedroom and pulled my olive drab duffel bag from the closet. I packed precisely only uniform essentials, physical training gear, and my secure communications devices. I did not pack a single piece of jewelry or clothing he had bought me. I was not going on a retreat. I was deploying. Before I walked out the front door, I told Jamal I needed to grab my charging cables from my office. He nodded, sipping his bourbon, completely oblivious to the fact that I was about to arm a digital landmine right under his feet. I walked down the hall and unlocked my secure office door. I sat down at my desk and opened my classified network interface. I did not need Hollywood hacker magic to catch them. I just needed basic cybersecurity protocols. I generated a dummy file. I filled it with outdated, unclassified supply chain logistics from a decade-old training manual. But I formatted the headers to look exactly like a highly restricted Department of Defense strategic proposal. I titled the document DoD Strategic Logistics Final. Then I armed the file. I embedded a digital watermark and a tracking beacon directly into the metadata. The moment that file was copied, downloaded, or transferred to an external drive, it would silently ping my secure server. It would record the exact time, the IP address, and the physical machine identification number of the device stealing it. I placed the glowing, irresistible trap right on the center of my desktop. I locked my computer, logged out of the primary firewall, and left the office. I walked past my husband, handed him my house key, and walked out the front door without looking back. By the time I checked into my sparse, sterile room at the officer housing facility, my phone was already vibrating with the fallout. Vivian and Aaliyah had wasted absolutely no time. They were moving with surgical precision to destroy my reputation before I could ever expose their impending bankruptcy or theft. In their wealthy, status-obsessed circle, controlling the narrative was everything. Vivian began making calls immediately. She started with the president of our elite African-American country club and moved directly to the senior pastor of our mega church. The story they spun was vicious and calculated. Vivian told everyone that the pressure of my military service had finally broken me. She claimed I had suffered a severe mental breakdown, attacked her son in a fit of paranoid delusion, and abandoned my marriage. Aaliyah took the campaign straight to social media. She posted a photo of Jamal looking somber with a caption asking for prayers during our family difficult season of mental health struggles. She made sure to tag her exclusive sorority sisters and every high society contact in Atlanta. My phone filled with text messages from women I considered friends. They disguised their gossip as concern, asking if I was safe and offering fake sympathy for my supposed psychiatric crisis. They were laying the groundwork to completely discredit me. If I tried to accuse Harrison and his defense firm of corporate espionage later, I would just look like the crazy, vindictive wife making up wild lies because my husband left me. It was a flawless social strategy, but they made one massive miscalculation. They assumed I cared about their country club politics. I did not care about brunch invitations or church gossip. I cared about federal treason. I turned off my notifications and set my phone on the small metal desk in my quarters. I opened my encrypted laptop and brought up the network monitoring dashboard. I sat in the quiet room drinking black coffee and waited. Discipline is the hardest part of any operation. It is the ability to sit perfectly still while your enemies celebrate their false victories. I watched the sun set over the naval base. I watched the hours tick by on my digital clock. It took exactly 12 hours. At 2 inches the morning, the dark screen of my laptop suddenly illuminated. A silent red alert flashed across the dashboard. Jamal and Wyatt had bypassed the physical lock on my home office door. They were in my system and they had just downloaded the dummy file. I watched the red alert pulse on my screen. The digital watermark embedded in my decoy file had just been triggered. Jamal and Wyatt had taken the bait completely. They had downloaded the dummy logistics proposal onto Wyatt's personal hard drive, and within minutes, the tracking beacon showed the file moving across the network to the corporate servers of Harrison's defense contracting firm. The theft was complete, but I knew that unauthorized access alone would only result in a slap on the wrist for Harrison and a quiet discharge for Wyatt. I needed them to commit federal treason. I needed them to submit that stolen file to the United States government. The next morning, I bypassed the local base command entirely. Local command structures are too vulnerable to gossip and internal politics. I needed the heavy artillery. I drove directly to the regional headquarters of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and requested an immediate secure meeting with their Cyber Crimes Division and a representative from the Judge Advocate General. I sat at a cold metal table in a windowless briefing room across from a JAG attorney named Commander Jackson and a senior NCIS cyber agent named Davis. I did not waste their time with emotional stories about my failing marriage or my fragile brother-in-law. I handed them a thick, encrypted tablet containing a flawless digital dossier. I walked them through the IP access logs, the biometric bypass times, and the exact metadata footprint of the watermark I had placed on the decoy file. I showed them the geographic ping confirming the classified data was currently sitting on the private commercial servers of Harrison's defense firm. Then I handed them the financial records I had pulled from Jamal's unencrypted folders. I showed them the $12 million of hidden debt crushing Harrison's company and the internal emails between Jamal and his father discussing their desperate need to secure the upcoming $40 million Department of Defense logistics contract. The silence in the interrogation room was heavy. Agent Davis looked at the screen and then looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and absolute disbelief. He realized immediately that my husband and his family were attempting to defraud the federal government using stolen military intelligence to secure a massive defense contract. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a bruised ego at a dinner table. It was a severe national security threat orchestrated by an elite family who believed their wealth put them above the law. Agent Davis leaned back in his chair and outlined the strategy. If we arrested Wyatt and Jamal today, they could claim it was a misunderstanding or a simple security violation. They could hire expensive lawyers and plead down to a misdemeanor. But if we waited until Harrison officially submitted the stolen logistics proposal as his own proprietary bid to the Department of Defense, the charges would escalate to massive corporate espionage and defrauding the federal government. The trap would be inescapable. But to make it work, NCIS needed time to monitor the file and intercept the official bid. They needed me to do the hardest thing a person can do when they are under attack. They needed me to do absolutely nothing. I had to let my husband think he had outsmarted me. I had to let Harrison believe he was going to win the $40 million contract. I had to agree to play the quiet, broken wife for the next 2 weeks. I looked Agent Davis dead in the eye and agreed without a second of hesitation. For the next 14 days, I lived in the sterile, temporary officer housing on the base. My daily routine was built on absolute military discipline. I woke up at 0400 hours, ran 5 miles in the dark, ate a highly regulated diet, and spent my days reviewing legitimate classified intelligence for my actual operational duties. I completely detached myself from the civilian world I had shared with Jamal. I treated my marriage exactly like a compromised asset in a hostile zone. I severed the emotional connection and focused entirely on the objective. Meanwhile, the smear campaign orchestrated by Vivian and Aaliyah was raging like a wildfire through Atlanta. My phone constantly lit up with texts from the elite African-American country club circle Jamal cared so much about. Women I had hosted for dinner parties sent me passive-aggressive messages offering to pray for my mental health. Vivian had successfully spread the lie that the pressure of the military had caused me to suffer a complete psychiatric breakdown. She told the senior pastor at their megachurch that I had violently attacked Wyatt in a fit of delusion and abandoned my husband in the middle of the night to hide my shame. Aaliyah posted crying emojis on social media asking for privacy for her family while they dealt with my tragic mental instability. They were working overtime to destroy my reputation, so that if I ever tried to accuse them of theft, no one would believe the crazy arranged wife. Jamal even sent me a long, manipulative email claiming he still loved me, but needed me to seek inpatient therapy before he could let me back into the house. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting, designed to make him look like a suffering, devoted husband to anyone who might read his emails later. The restraint required to sit in a small cinder block room and watch my character be assassinated by a group of materialistic social climbers was immense. Every instinct told me to defend myself, to post the proof online, to scream the truth from the rooftops. But I knew that true power is silent. True power does not argue with country club gossip. True power waits for the enemy to step blindly into the kill zone. I ignored every phone call. I deleted every fake text message. I gave them exactly what they wanted to see: absolute silence. Jamal interpreted my lack of response as surrender. He genuinely believed that his psychological manipulation had worked. He thought I was hiding in the barracks, too embarrassed and mentally fragile to face his powerful family. He had no idea that I was simply waiting for the federal snare to snap shut around his neck. On the 14th day of my isolation, I checked my secure post office box on the base. Mixed in with standard military correspondence was a thick, heavy envelope made of expensive cream cardstock. The return address bore the official seal of the Department of Defense. I opened it carefully. It was a formal gold-embossed invitation to the annual Naval Intelligence and Defense Contractors Gala in Washington, D.C. This was the most exclusive and prestigious event in the military contracting world. It was a highly publicized black-tie affair where politicians, generals, and corporate executives gathered to celebrate the intersection of military power and private industry. It was also the exact event where the Pentagon would publicly announce the winner of the $40 million logistics contract. I knew Harrison had purchased an entire VIP table for his family. He fully expected to walk onto that stage and accept a massive government payout using the exact data his son had stolen from my hard drive. He was planning to cement his legacy as a brilliant defense contractor in front of the highest-ranking military officials in the country. Jamal and Wyatt would be sitting right beside him, soaking up the stolen glory and congratulating themselves on getting away with the perfect crime. I ran my thumb over the gold lettering on the invitation. A notification chimed on my secure mobile device. It was a brief encrypted message from Agent Davis, confirming that the official bid had been received and processed by the Federal Review Board. The bait had been swallowed whole. The venue was set and my dress whites were freshly pressed. My dress whites hung perfectly pressed in the small closet of my temporary quarters. I was standing by the window looking out over the quiet naval base when my secure phone buzzed on the metal desk. It was a picture message from Aaliyah. She was standing on a pedestal in a high-end Atlanta boutique, wearing a custom emerald green silk gown, the kind of dress that cost more than a junior enlisted sailor made in an entire year. The caption below the photo read, "Exactly as I expected. Getting my final fittings for the Washington Gala tonight. Wyatt is being honored by the top brass. Too bad you lost your clearance and your husband all in 1 week. We will be sure to send you pictures from the VIP table. Try to focus on your healing." The sheer hubris of it was almost impressive. They were literally parading their stolen victory. They had broken into my secure home office, stolen my classified logistical frameworks, and were now buying designer gowns to celebrate the massive federal contract they believed they had successfully hijacked. An hour later, an email arrived from Jamal. The subject line simply read, "Moving forward." He wrote it with the cold, detached tone of a human resources manager firing an incompetent employee. He told me he was willing to forgive my violent outburst and keep my psychiatric breakdown out of the public record. In exchange, he had his lawyers draft a separation agreement. High wanted me to sign over my entire equity in our home and transfer my personal savings to his account to cover the emotional damages I had caused his family. He actually framed the extortion as a favor to me. He said he was trying to protect me from the stress of a messy public divorce while I was in such a fragile mental state. He told me that if I just signed the paperwork quietly, he would make sure Vivian and Aaliyah stopped talking about my mental health to our friends. I read the email twice. I did not cry. I did not throw my phone across the room. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace. When your enemy shows you exactly who they are, it removes any lingering hesitation you might have about destroying them. Jamal thought he was dealing with a broken, weeping woman who would surrender everything just to make the bullying stop. I did not reply to Jamal. I did not respond to Aaliyah. I forwarded the email directly to my civilian divorce attorney. Her name was Maxine, and she was a ruthless legal predator who specialized in high-asset military divorces. I drove off the base and met Maxine in her downtown office. I sat across from her heavy glass desk and handed her a printed copy of Jamal's extortion attempt. Maxine read the email and let out a dry, sharp laugh. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "He wants the house, the savings, and a permanent gag order," she said, shaking her head. "And what exactly are we giving him, Kendra?" I reached into my briefcase and handed her a sealed folder containing the unclassified summary of the impending federal indictment. "I am giving him a federal subpoena," I replied, keeping my voice dead level. "I am giving him 20 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate espionage and defrauding the United States government. I want the divorce petition drafted immediately. I want an absolute lockdown on all my financial assets and a restraining order prepared because by tomorrow night, my husband is going to be a convicted felon with zero income, and I am not paying a single cent of his legal defense." Maxine read through the summary. Her eyes widened as she processed the sheer magnitude of the trap I had set. She looked at me with a mixture of deep respect and lethal readiness. "Consider it done," she said, tapping her pen on the desk. "Where do you want him served?" I smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. "I want him served in a tuxedo in front of every high-ranking military official in Washington." I left Maxine's office with my financial armor fully locked in place. I returned to the base, packed my gear, and boarded a military transport flight to Washington District of Columbia early the next morning. The air in the capital was crisp and charged with electricity. I checked into a secure hotel room arranged by the Federal Cyber Division just 3 blocks away from the grand ballroom where the gala was being held. Agent Davis met me in my room for the final tactical briefing. He opened his laptop and showed me the active surveillance feed. Harrison's defense firm had not just submitted my stolen logistics file, they had made it the absolute centerpiece of their entire presentation. Harrison had slapped his company logo on my classified algorithms and presented it to the Pentagon Review Board as a revolutionary breakthrough that his son Wyatt had developed during his deployment. "They actually put Wyatt's name as the lead architect on the proposal," Agent Davis said, shaking his head in disbelief. "The arrogance is staggering. They essentially gift-wrapped the espionage charges for us. We have the metadata matching your exact keystrokes from your home office. We have the network transfer logs from Jamal's router. And now we have Harrison formally signing a federal bidding document swearing that the stolen data is his own original property. What is the timeline for tonight?" I asked, buttoning the cuffs of my dress uniform. "The fleet admiral is going to take the stage at exactly 2,100 hours. Agent Davis explained. "He will begin the announcement for the $40 million logistics contract." Harrison and his family are seated at table 1 directly in front of the podium. They have been told they are the finalists. They fully expect to be called up to accept the contract. My agents are already positioned at every exit in the ballroom disguised as event security. I nodded, picking up my uniform jacket. The pristine white fabric felt heavy with duty and purpose. I pinned my ribbons and combination medals to my chest, ensuring every single piece of metal was perfectly aligned. I had earned every single one of those decorations through sweat, blood, and absolute dedication to my country. Wyatt had tried to belittle my service because he was too cowardly to earn his own. Jamal had tried to erase my brilliant mind because he was too weak to stand beside a strong woman. Tonight, they were going to learn that you cannot steal someone's brilliance and expect to survive the burn. I looked in the mirror. My hair was pulled back into a strict regulation bun. My boots were polished to a mirror shine. I did not look like the broken, hysterical wife Vivian had described to her country club friends. I looked like a weapon drawn and ready to fire. Agent Davis handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside were the divorce papers, the asset protection orders, and the federal subpoenas Maxine had drafted. I tucked the envelope securely under my arm, "It is time," Commander Agent Davis said, opening the door to the hallway. I walked out of the hotel room and stepped into the waiting black sport utility vehicle. The drive to the gala venue took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like the culmination of my entire life. I was about to walk into a room filled with the most powerful military contractors in the free world and publicly execute the family that had tried to bury me. The trap was fully loaded. The safety was off. There was absolutely no turning back now. The Washington District of Columbia night air was biting cold, but the atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the defense gala was suffocatingly warm. Crystal chandeliers, the size of small cars, hung from the vated ceilings, casting a golden glow over a sea of tailored tuxedos and military dress uniforms. I stood on the second-floor mezzanine, hidden in the shadows of a heavy velvet curtain, looking down at the main floor. Agent Davis and his undercover federal cyber team were positioned perfectly at every exit. The trap was completely set, and my targets were entirely unaware. I located Table 1 easily. It was positioned right at the front of the stage, a prime piece of real estate reserved for the biggest winners of the night. Harrison was standing at the head of the table, holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon. He was laughing deeply, clapping a 4-star general on the shoulder and playing the role of the brilliant defense patriarch. He looked incredibly smug. He truly believed he had outsmarted the federal government. I thought his outdated and failing company had secured a $40 million contract using the brilliance of his own bloodline. He had absolutely no idea the digital guillotine was currently hovering inches above his neck. Just to his right stood Wyatt. My white brother-in-law was wearing his navy dress blues, his chest puffing out as he spoke to a group of wealthy defense analysts. I could read his body language perfectly. He was gesturing wildly, acting out some fabricated story of military hardship. He was soaking up the unearned admiration, playing the part of the rugged combat veteran, when in reality, his greatest military achievement was approving a shipment of printer paper and bottled water. He looked so proud of himself, standing there in a uniform he was actively disgracing. Then there was Jamal. My husband was working the room with a glass of champagne in his hand. He was standing next to his sister Aaliyah, who was wearing that exact emerald green silk gown she had bragged about in her text message. Vivian was right beside them, wearing a blinding amount of diamonds and introducing Jamal to high-ranking politicians. They were taking photos, smiling brightly, and networking with billionaires. Jamal looked so comfortable in that world of shallow prestige. He looked like a man who had successfully disposed of his inconvenient wife and secured his family wealth forever. I watched them celebrate their stolen victory for exactly 10 minutes. I watched them toast to their own arrogance. It was fascinating to see how easily they wore their lies. They felt no guilt over trying to destroy my sanity or my career. They felt no remorse for stealing classified data from my secure home office. They only felt the thrill of getting away with it. But they were celebrating in a room fully wired by federal agents, and their victory was a manufactured illusion. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Agent Davis. He gave me a single firm nod. It was time to initiate the final sequence. I walked away from the mezzanine and made my way down the heavily guarded back staircase to the primary VIP staging room. Fleet Admiral Sterling and several of the highest-ranking Department of Defense officials were waiting. When the Admiral saw me, he extended his hand. He knew exactly what I had uncovered, and he knew exactly what was about to happen in that ballroom. I knew the level of corporate treason Harrison had committed, and he respected the tactical precision I had used to expose the entire operation. The heavy brass doors of the main ballroom slowly began to open. A protocol officer tapped a microphone on the main stage and asked the room to please stand for the arrival of the Fleet Admiral. The low hum of conversation evaporated instantly. Over 500 of the most powerful military and corporate figures in the country fell completely silent and turned their attention to the grand entryway. The spotlight hit the center aisle. The Admiral walked out into the light, and I walked exactly 1/2 step behind him to his right. My dress whites were immaculate. The fabric was blindingly bright under the chandeliers. The gold rank insignia on my shoulders caught the light, and the rows of heavy combat decorations pinned to my chest signaled absolute and undeniable authority. I was not walking like a discarded, emotionally broken wife. I was walking with the measured lethal precision of a highly decorated naval aviator. The sound of my polished boots striking the marble floor echoed through the silent room. As we made our way down the center aisle, the crowd parted for us. I could see the faces of defense contractors and politicians turning to look at me. They were whispering, trying to figure out who the decorated female officer was and why she was flanking the most powerful man in the room. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, projecting nothing but cold military discipline. We approached the front of the room. The stage was elevated just 10 feet away from table 1. The admiral took his place at the podium while I stood at attention beside the stage steps facing the crowd. Then I slowly turned my head and looked directly at table 1. Harrison froze with his bourbon glass halfway to his mouth. The smug smile melted off his face, leaving a mask of pure terror. He recognized my uniform. He recognized the combat medals. He recognized the absolute disaster standing in front of him. Jamal went completely rigid, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he stared at the woman he had tried to convince the world was insane. The color drained from his face and his jaw went slack. He looked at the heavy manila envelope tucked securely under my arm, and he knew his perfect life was over. Wyatt saw the classified command badges on my chest and his face turned chalk white. He took a physical step backward, bumping into his chair. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal, realizing he was in a room full of real military leaders who were about to watch him burn for stolen valor and espionage. Aaliyah gasped so sharply she nearly dropped her expensive champagne glass onto the floor. Vivian clutched her pearl necklace, her mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. They were all staring at a ghost. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of lies and social media gossip. They thought I was hiding in a dark room crying over my ruined marriage. Instead, I was standing in the center of their most triumphant moment, holding the match that was going to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The trap had snapped shut. There was no way out. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead as the fleet admiral, and I continued our measured pace down the center aisle. The absolute paralysis at table 1 was palpable. I could feel the heat of their collective panic radiating through the cool air of the ballroom. They were trapped in a public spectacle of their own making, and the realization was suffocating them. Wyatt broke first. His fragile superiority complex simply could not process the sight of a black woman he had relentlessly mocked, standing shoulder to shoulder with the highest-ranking naval officer in the room. He shoved his check, making a loud scraping sound against the polished marble floor that drew annoyed glances from the surrounding billionaires and defense analysts. He stepped directly into the center aisle, attempting to block my path to the staging area at the foot of the podium. I was sweating profusely. The stiff collar of his dress blues suddenly looked entirely too tight for his thick neck. He lunged forward, leaning in close so the surrounding dignitaries could not hear his frantic, desperate whispering. "Maya, what do you think you are doing?" He hissed his breath, smelling of stale champagne and pure, unadulterated fear. "You need to turn around and leave right now before I call event security and have you arrested for trespassing. You are going to ruin everything for Harrison. Get out of here before I make a scene." He actually reached out his hand, attempting to grab my forearm and physically steer me away from the stage. It was the ultimate display of his arrogant delusion. He still thought he was dealing with a submissive civilian wife he could bully in a private dining room. He had absolutely no comprehension of the tactical environment he was standing in. I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride or show a single ounce of alarm. I effortlessly sidestepped his clumsy attempt to grab my arm, letting his hand swipe through empty air. I paused for exactly 1 second, adjusting the bright gold cuffs of my immaculate uniform. I looked him up and down, taking in the pathetic display of a man who had built his entire identity on unearned bravado and stolen valor. "Lieutenant, you are speaking to a superior officer," I said, my voice cold, sharp, and carrying enough command authority to freeze the blood in his veins. "Step back before I have you detained." Wyatt choked on his next breath. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child playing dress-up in a military uniform. His eyes darted to the heavy combat decorations pinned to my chest, then to the gold oak leaves on my shoulders, and finally, to the stern faces of the undercover federal agents I knew were watching his every move from the perimeter. He was completely paralyzed. For the first time in his life, he was facing actual unyielding military discipline, and his fragile ego shattered instantly. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into the edge of his own table and lowered his head in absolute submission. I did not give him another glance. I resumed my place beside the fleet admiral and walked the remaining distance to the front of the room. The brief interaction had not gone unnoticed by the elite crowd. Whispers began to ripple through the front rows of the ballroom. Powerful defense contractors and senior political figures were leaning over their tables, asking each other who the highly decorated female officer was and why she had just publicly dressed down a logistics lieutenant in front of the entire assembly. I took my designated position at attention beside the polished wooden stairs leading up to the main stage. From this vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of Table 1. I allowed myself a brief moment to observe the absolute carnage I had brought to my husband and his family. Jamal was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were stark white. He was staring at me with a look of profound horror. He finally understood the gravity of the dummy file he had stolen from my home office. He finally realized that I had never been paranoid or unstable. I had been hunting him. He looked at the heavy manila envelope still tucked securely under my arm, and I saw his chest heave as he struggled to draw breath. The polished, arrogant investment banker, who had tried to gaslight me into a psychiatric facility, was currently hyperventilating in a room full of his personal heroes. Harrison was faring even worse. The great patriarch of the family had completely collapsed into his chair. His hands were shaking violently, causing the ice in his glass to clatter against the crystal. He was staring at the stage, his mind desperately trying to calculate a way out of the federal snare that had just tightened around his throat. He knew the Department of Defense Review Board had his official bidding documents. I knew he had sworn under penalty of perjury that the classified logistics data was his own proprietary creation. He knew he was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. Aaliyah and Vivian were frozen in a state of superficial panic. They did not fully grasp the legal and military destruction that was about to rain down on their family, but they understood the social implications perfectly. They could feel the eyes of their elite country club peers turning toward their table. They could feel the whispers and the judgment. Vivian frantically tried to smooth her dress and force a smile, but her face was rigid with terror. Aaliyah kept looking at Wyatt, who was still standing by his chair, staring at the floor in complete humiliation. Her custom emerald green gown suddenly looked entirely out of place on a woman whose husband was about to be federally indicted. The air in the grand ballroom shifted as the fleet admiral ascended the wooden stairs and took his place behind the podium. He adjusted his reading glasses and placed a heavy leather-bound folder onto the slanted wooden surface. The room, which had been buzzing with low whispers and the clinking of expensive silverware, fell into a deep, expectant silence. Every eye in the massive space locked onto the stage. The admiral leaned forward and tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, rhythmic thud echoed through the advanced sound system, commanding the absolute attention of over 500 attendees. The lighting in the ballroom dimmed slightly, leaving only the bright, dramatic spotlights focused directly on the stage in the front row tables. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," the admiral began, his deep, resonant voice filling the expansive room. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the vital partnership between our armed forces and the brilliant minds of the private defense sector. We are here to recognize innovation, dedication, and the relentless pursuit of national security." He paused, looking out over the crowd, his eyes briefly locked onto Harrison. I saw my father-in-law swallow hard, a bead of sweat tracing a line down the side of his face. Tonight, we were scheduled to announce the recipient of a highly competitive $40 million logistics and supply chain contract. The admiral continued holding the edges of the podium, a contract designed to modernize our deployment capabilities in hostile environments. We received several impressive proposals from the esteemed defense firms represented in this room today. The tension at table enough to suffocate a person. Jamal was completely paralyzed, unable to even look away from the stage. Wyatt looked like he might actually vomit. However, the admiral said, his tone suddenly shifting from celebratory to aggressively stern. "The United States military relies on the absolute integrity of our civilian partners. We demand excellence, but above all else, we demand honor." The silence in the ballroom deepened into something dangerous. The seasoned contractors and generals in the crowd instantly recognized the shift in the admiral's tone. This was no longer an award ceremony. This was an execution. The admiral tapped the microphone one final time, letting the sharp sound ring out before he delivered the hook that would drag my husband's family straight to the bottom of the ocean. The sharp sound of the microphone tap hung in the heavy air of the grand ballroom. Fleet Admiral Sterling gripped the edges of the polished wooden podium and leaned forward. The jovial, celebratory atmosphere from just moments ago had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, clinical tension that only high-ranking military personnel truly understand how to project. I stood at pared rest at the bottom of the stage stairs, my eyes fixed on the man who was about to dismantle my husband's family on national television. The admiral swept his gaze across the front row tables, making sure to let his eyes linger on Harrison for a fraction of a second too long. "When we gathered here tonight, we intended to award a $40 million contract for advanced deployment logistics," the admiral said, his voice echoing through the silent room. "We were looking for partners who possess the intellectual capacity to innovate and the moral fortitude to handle classified national security assets." He paused, and the silence was deafening. I watched Harrison from my peripheral vision. The retired captain was clutching the edge of his table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was breathing through his mouth, taking short, shallow gasps like a man suffocating in plain sight. Jamal was sitting rigidly beside him, looking as though his soul had already left his body. "Instead of awarding that contract," the admiral continued, "we are launching a sweeping federal audit into severe bidding corruption and corporate espionage." A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite defense contractors and politicians filling the ballroom. People shifted in their seats, exchanging shocked glances. In the defense industry, an accusation of corporate espionage at a public gala was the equivalent of a nuclear detonation. "We have confirmed that a prominent defense firm sitting in this very room attempted to defraud the United States government," the admiral said, his voice booming with righteous anger. "They submitted a proprietary logistics bid, claiming it was their own original innovation. In reality, they executed a targeted cyber breach to steal highly classified algorithms directly from the restricted servers of the Joint Special Operations Command." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Billionaires and generals were leaning across their tables trying to figure out who the traitor was. At table 1, Vivian let out a soft, whimpering sound. She finally realized this was not a misunderstanding. She realized her husband and her son had committed federal treason, and they were about to be publicly slaughtered for it. Aaliyah was staring at the stage with her mouth hanging open, her expensive emerald green gown suddenly looking like a prison uniform. Wyatt had completely folded into himself, slouching in his chair and refusing to look at anyone. "But the United States Navy was not blindsided by this theft," the admiral said, raising his voice over the whispers of the crowd. "This espionage was intercepted, dismantled, and documented not by a routine system check, but by the absolute brilliance of the original architect of those stolen logistics." The admiral turned away from the podium and looked directly at me. "We are not just here to expose a betrayal," the admiral announced. "We are here to honor an officer who embodies the absolute highest standards of military excellence and personal integrity. This officer did not just design the logistical frameworks that keep our special operators alive behind enemy lines. She is also a legendary combat aviator who risked her own life plunging into a hostile valley in Syria under heavy anti-aircraft fire to provide catastrophic closed air support for a pinned-down unit. She saved 42 American lives that day." The crowd was completely captivated. The defense analysts who had been hanging on Wyatt's every word just 30 minutes ago were now staring at the stage in absolute awe. They were hearing the official declassification of a military legend right before their eyes. When the admiral mentioned my call sign and my Syrian deployment, I made sure to look right at Wyatt. He had demanded to know what I actually did all day. I had joked that I just processed leave requests and inventoried cafeteria snacks. Now he was sitting in a puddle of his own sweat, listening to a fleet admiral describe how I navigated a heavily defended combat airspace to neutralize an enemy stronghold. The absolute decimation of his fragile ego was a beautiful thing to witness. "Lieutenant Commander," the admiral called out, projecting his voice to the very back of the massive ballroom, "please join me on stage." I executed a crisp, perfect face toward the stairs. I marched up the wooden steps, my polished boots moving with rhythmic precision. I did not look at my husband. I did not look at the man who had tried to convince me I was insane to cover up his theft. I looked only at the fleet admiral. When I reached the center of the stage, I stopped and snapped a flawless salute. The admiral returned the salute with profound respect. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. 500 of the most powerful people in Washington District of Columbia rose to their feet, giving me a standing ovation. The sound was deafening. I stood at the podium looking out over the sea of clapping hands and tailored suits. I let the applause wash over me, but I did not smile. I maintained absolute military bearing. The admiral stepped back to the microphone, raising a hand to quiet the massive crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," the admiral said, his voice echoing through the speakers, "I present to you Lieutenant Commander Maya, known to the Special Operations community by her call sign. Tonight, we commend her for her exceptional service and for single-handedly uncovering a massive domestic breach of national security." The applause started to swell again, but the admiral held up his hand, stopping it instantly. The execution was not over. Because of Commander Maya's flawless tactical restraint, the admiral continued, "We were able to track the stolen data from the moment it was illegally downloaded from her secure home office directly to the commercial servers of the firm that submitted the fraudulent bid. Today, we have the IP logs. We have the biometric bypass data. We have the digital watermarks." I turned my head very slowly and looked down at table 1. Harrison was sweating profusely. His eyes were darting toward the exits, but he could clearly see the undercover federal agent standing by the heavy brass doors. There was nowhere to run. Jamal was shaking his head back and forth, muttering to himself, caught in a loop of absolute panic. He had tried to steal my brilliance to save his father, and instead he had delivered his entire family into a federal snare. It is a tragedy when those who once wore the uniform choose greed over honor. The admiral said, his gaze dropping like a physical weight onto the front row. It is a disgrace when a retired officer attempts to steal from active duty personnel to line his own pockets. The stage director standing in the wings gave a swift hand signal to the lighting crew in the balcony. The warm golden chandeliers illuminating the grand ballroom suddenly dimmed, plunging the majority of the room into dark shadows. A second later, a massive, blindingly bright white spotlight swung down from the vaulted ceiling. The beam of light cut through the darkness and hit table 1 with the force of a physical blow. Harrison, Jamal, Wyatt, Vivian, and Aaliyah were instantly bathed in a harsh, glaring circle of light. They flinched, raising their hands to shield their eyes from the blinding illumination. Every single person in the massive ballroom stopped breathing. 500 elite defense contractors, 4-star generals, politicians, and federal investigators all turned their heads simultaneously. They stared directly into the center of the spotlight. They looked at the retired captain gripping his chest. They looked at the sweating investment banker. They looked at the logistics lieutenant shrinking in his dress blues. They looked at the 2 women covered in diamonds who were suddenly the center of a national scandal. The entire room realized exactly who had committed the treason. I stood on the elevated stage, looking down at the family who had treated me like garbage for 5 years. They had called me a diversity hire. They had mocked my career. They had tried to push me into a psychiatric facility to steal my life's work, and now they were sitting completely paralyzed, trapped in a cage of light while the most powerful people in the country watched them burn. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt the cold, satisfying weight of absolute justice. The trap had snapped shut. The audience was watching, and it was time to deliver the final blow. The blinding white spotlight held my husband and his family in a merciless cage of illumination. I stood at the edge of the stage, letting the absolute silence of the grand ballroom amplify their humiliation. 500 of the most powerful people in Washington District of Columbia watched as the facade of the great Harrison family crumbled into dust. I gave the fleet admiral a single sharp nod. He stepped back from the podium, yielding the floor entirely to me. I turned and began my descent down the wooden stairs. My polished boots struck the steps with a heavy rhythmic thud that echoed through the massive room. Every step I took felt like a gavel coming down on the lies they had built their lives upon. As I reached the marble floor, the crowd physically parted for me. 4-star generals and billionaire defense executives stepped back, creating a clear, unobstructed path directly to table 1. They looked at me with deep respect, but they looked at my husband and his family with pure, unadulterated disgust. In their world, there is no sin greater than stealing from the military you claim to serve. From the perimeter of the room, Agent Davis and his undercover cyber team finally moved. They shed their disguises, pulling federal badges from inside their tailored jackets. They moved with the swift, terrifying precision of men who hunt traitors for a living. They did not rush, but their pace was relentless. They cut through the sea of tables, converging on the front row from all 4 sides, forming an impenetrable wall of federal authority around my in-laws. Harrison saw the federal agents approaching and tried to stand. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed heavily back into his chair. He reached for his chest, gasping for air as the reality of federal prison materialized right in front of him. Vivian grabbed his arm, her diamond bracelets clinking against his sleeve. She was whispering frantically, her eyes darting around the room, looking for someone, anyone to intervene. But the politicians and socialites she had spent years kissing up to were actively turning their backs to her. No one wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal espionage indictment. Aaliyah was crying now, real messy tears that ruined her expensive makeup. She kept looking at Wyatt, who was practically trying to merge with the fabric of his chair. He was wearing the uniform of a United States Navy lieutenant, but he had the posture of a coward who had finally been backed into a corner. He knew military police were waiting just outside those heavy brass doors to strip him of his rank and his freedom. I walked past all of them and stopped directly in front of Jamal. My husband was sweating through his custom-tailored tuxedo. The arrogant investment banker who had spent 5 years treating me like an inconvenient diversity quota was trembling so hard his champagne glass rattled against the table. He looked up at me, and for a fleeting second I saw the man I thought I had married. But that man was an illusion. The man sitting in front of me was a thief who had tried to convince me I was losing my mind just to steal my life's work. He looked at my crisp white uniform. He looked at the gold oak leaves on my shoulders and the rows of combat decorations on my chest. For years, he had demanded that I shrink myself to make him feel bigger. He had allowed his family to mock my career because his own ego was too fragile to stand beside a strong, successful black woman. Now he was forced to look up at me while I held his entire future in the palm of my hand. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clinical resolution. I did not feel heartbreak. I did not feel the sting of his betrayal anymore. I only felt the clean, sharp edge of justice. I had given this man my loyalty, my trust, and my home. In return, he had tried to feed me to the wolves to save his father's bankrupt company. He had actively plotted to have me institutionalized. I shifted the heavy, thick manila envelope I had been carrying under my left arm. It contained the flawless legal destruction my civilian attorney had drafted specifically for this moment. It contained every IP log, every bank statement, and every piece of evidence proving Jamal had bypassed my home security network. It was the physical manifestation of his treason. I held the envelope out toward him, holding it just inches from his chest. Jamal stared at the thick package. His mind was fracturing, trying to process the impossibility of the situation. He was surrounded by armed federal agents. He was caught on national television committing treason against the United States government. His father's company was dead. His brother-in-law was about to be court-martialed. Yet, his massive, fragile ego still tried to find a way to survive the moment. He still believed he could manipulate his way out of this if he just played the right angle. He puffed out his chest, attempting to look down his nose at me, even while sitting paralyzed in a chair. He desperately needed the surrounding billionaires and military officials to think he was still the one in control. He wanted them to believe his crazy arranged wife had simply shown up to cause a scene and beg for his forgiveness. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice shaking, but loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. An apology. It was the most pathetic display of arrogance I had ever witnessed. He was literally minutes away from being placed in federal handcuffs, and he was still trying to gaslight me in public. He still thought I was the submissive woman who would back down to avoid embarrassing him. I did not lower my voice. I did not whisper. I projected my voice using the exact command tone I used when barking orders over the roar of jet engines on a flight deck. I made sure every single defense contractor, general, and federal investigator within 50 feet heard exactly what I had to say. I wanted his humiliation to be absolute and permanent. I dropped the heavy envelope directly onto his pristine white dinner plate, knocking his silverware aside. "No," I replied, holding his terrified gaze as the reality of my words crushed the last ounce of hope from his body. "It is a divorce petition, a restraining order, and a federal subpoena for corporate espionage." Jamal stared at the thick manila envelope resting on his pristine dinner plate. The words, "divorce petition, restraining order, and federal subpoena," hung in the air between us, heavy and inescapable. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He looked down at the documents and then back up at my face. He was searching for any trace of the submissive wife he thought he could manipulate into a psychiatric facility. He found absolutely nothing. I stood there looking at him with the cold, detached observation of a soldier assessing a neutralized threat. The blinding white spotlight continued to isolate Table 1 from the rest of the dark ballroom. The silence in the room was absolute. 500 of the most powerful military and corporate figures in Washington were holding their breath, watching the destruction of a legacy unfold in real time. Wyatt realized the situation was completely unsalvageable. The arrogant logistics lieutenant, who had spent the entire evening bragging about his fabricated military prowess, suddenly understood that he was facing actual unyielding federal justice. He did what cowards always do when their lies are exposed. He tried to run. Wyatt shoved his chair back so violently that it tipped over and crashed onto the polished marble floor. The sharp sound echoed through the grand ballroom, causing several high-ranking dignitaries to flinch. He turned his back on his wife, his father-in-law, and the mess he had helped create, and he sprinted directly toward the heavy brass doors at the back of the venue. He was panting heavily, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the slick floor as panic overrode his basic motor skills. I did not make it far. The military police had been waiting patiently in the shadows of the vestibule. As Wyatt reached for the door handles, two heavily armored military police officers stepped forward, blocking his path completely. Wyatt tried to pivot and dodge them, but he was sluggish and completely out of his depth. One of the officers grabbed Wyatt by the shoulder and swept his legs out from under him. Wyatt hit the marble floor with a sickening thud. The pristine dress blues he had worn to play the part of a war hero were instantly scuffed and ruined. He let out a loud, pathetic whine as the officers pinned his arms behind his back and secured his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. He was begging them to listen, claiming it was a mistake, claiming he did not know the files were classified. The elite crowd watched in absolute stunned silence as the fake war hero was dragged to his feet, sobbing openly, and marched out of the ballroom in complete disgrace. At table 1, the federal agents had surrounded Harrison. Agent Davis stepped forward and looked down at the retired captain. "Harrison, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government and multiple counts of corporate espionage," Agent Davis said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." Harrison did not fight. The great patriarch of the family, the man who demanded absolute submission from everyone in his orbit, had completely deflated. He slowly stood up from his chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Agent Davis pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt and secured them around Harrison's wrists. The sharp metallic click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet ballroom. Every single billionaire defense contractor and four-star general in the room watched as the man who had tried to steal my brilliance was reduced to a common criminal. This was a man who had built his entire persona on honor and excellence. Now he was leaving in handcuffs, in front of the exact peers he had desperately wanted to impress. His legacy, his company, and his freedom were completely gone in a matter of seconds. The reality of the situation finally broke through Vivian's pristine social facade. The matriarch who had spent 5 years treating me like a lower-ass diversity quota suddenly realized that I was the only person in the room with the power to stop the execution. She completely lost her mind. Vivian lunged out of her chair, her heavy diamond necklaces rattling against her chest. She pushed past Jamal and grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the crisp white fabric of my uniform sleeve. She was hyperventilating, her carefully styled hair falling out of place as she completely abandoned her refined country club aesthetic. "Maya, please," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "This is a mistake. You have to tell them this is a mistake. Harrison is a good man. Jamal is your husband. You have to protect the family. Please, Maya, do not do this to us. We can fix this. We can make it right." I looked down at her hand, clutching my uniform. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I slowly and deliberately reached over and detached her fingers from my arm, peeling her hand away as if she were a piece of lint. I looked her dead in the eye, watching the terror swim in her expression. "I am protecting my country, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper that only her table could hear. "You are just collateral damage." Vivian stumbled backward, covering her face with her hands, and collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. The other wealthy wives and socialites in the front row were actively turning their faces away from her, refusing to make eye contact. In their world, social death is swift and unforgiving. Vivian was officially a pariah. Alia was standing frozen next to her mother, staring at the doors where her husband had just been dragged out in handcuffs. The custom emerald green gown she had worn to celebrate my downfall was now the outfit she would wear in the darkest moment of her life. Her social climbing days were permanently over. She would be known forever as the woman whose husband committed treason to cover up his own incompetence. I turned my attention back to Jamal. He had not moved from his chair. He was staring at the federal agents escorting his father away. He had traded his marriage, his integrity, and his entire future for a $40 million contract that never actually existed. He had tried to silence me because my excellence made him feel small. Now he was the smallest man in the room, I did not say another word to him. There was nothing left to say. I turned my back on my husband and walked away from table 1, leaving him to face the federal agents waiting to process his arrest. As I walked back toward the stage, a sudden flurry of movement erupted near the press gallery. The media outlets that had been invited to cover the prestigious defense contract announcement had finally recovered from their shock. Camera flashes began exploding like strobe lights across the ballroom. The bright, blinding bursts of white light illuminated the absolute destruction of the family empire. Reporters were holding up their professional cameras and shouting questions over the rising chaos in the room. Some were already live streaming the event on their phones, narrating the unbelievable scene unfolding before them. They captured every single second of it. They captured Wyatt being hauled through the brass doors by military police, his face red and stained with tears. They captured Harrison, lowering his head in shame as federal agents marched him past his former military colleagues who looked at him with absolute disgust. They captured Vivian weeping into her hands while Aaliyah stared blankly into space, entirely broken by the sudden loss of her status. And they captured Jamal sitting alone at a table meant for highly respected VIPs, staring blankly at a divorce petition while his entire life burned to the ground around him. The elite facade they had spent decades building was being destroyed in real-time broadcast directly to every news station and social media feed in the country. They had cared about their reputation more than anything else in the world. They had sacrificed my mental health and my career just to protect their public image. And now that very image was entirely dead. The execution was flawless. The morning after the Washington gala, the sunlight filtering through my hotel window felt remarkably clean. I sat at the small desk in my dress uniform pants and a plain black shirt drinking black coffee while watching the national news networks. The story had broken with devastating speed. The footage captured by the defense reporters the night before was playing on a continuous loop across every major channel. There was Harrison being marched out of the grand ballroom in handcuffs. There was Wyatt crying in his ruined dress blues. And there was Jamal staring blankly at the divorce petition I had dropped on his plate. The media stripped away their elite facade in less than 12 hours. The headlines did not hold back. They called it one of the most brazen acts of corporate espionage in modern military history. By 8:00 the morning, the social execution of my mother-in-law and sister-in-law was already fully underway. In the wealthy, status-obsessed circles of Atlanta, social death is swift and entirely merciless. Vivian had spent her entire adult life cultivating her image at the country club and her mega church. She had used that exact network just weeks ago to spread vicious lies about my mental health. She told anyone who would listen that I was a broken, hysterical woman who had abandoned my husband. Now, those same people were watching her husband face decades in federal prison for treason. I received a text message from a mutual acquaintance who had been at the country club that morning. The club president had personally called Vivian before she even boarded her flight back to Georgia. He informed her that the board of directors had held an emergency vote. Her family membership was permanently revoked, effective immediately. They did not want federal investigators swarming their golf course, and they certainly did not want the wives of convicted felons sipping mimosas in their dining room. Aaliyah faced an identical, brutal reality. She had built her entire personality around being the glamorous wife of a military officer. She had bragged about her custom emerald green gown and mocked my career, but the military community is fiercely protective of its own. When the spouses of other officers learned that Wyatt had tried to steal classified data from a combat aviator, they completely isolated Aaliyah. Her prestigious sorority sisters blocked her phone number. The members of her church outreach committee removed her from every group chat. She was instantly excommunicated from the elite bubble she thought she ruled. They were both left absolutely alone with the horrifying reality of their actions. But the social humiliation was just the beginning of their punishment. The financial destruction was clinical and absolute. The Department of Defense moved with immediate lethal efficiency. Harrison had officially signed federal bidding documents, claiming my stolen logistics data was his own proprietary work. Because of that undeniable proof, the military completely blacklisted his defense consulting firm by noon. Every single existing government contract his company held was frozen and placed under federal audit. The moment the company was blacklisted, the house of cards collapsed entirely. Harrison had been hiding over $12 million in corporate debt to maintain their lavish lifestyle. He had leveraged his business, his luxury cars, and the massive gated compound in Atlanta. hoping the $40 million logistics contract would save him. Without the military contracts, the banks panicked. By mid-afternoon, the financial institutions called in all of his outstanding loans. They froze his corporate accounts and his personal assets to prevent him from moving money offshore. The bank holding the mortgage on the sprawling Atlanta estate issued an immediate notice of foreclosure. The imported oaks, the marble floors, the custom chandeliers, everything Vivian had valued more than basic human decency was going to be seized and auctioned off to pay for her husband's crimes. They were going to be left with absolutely nothing. While his parents' empire was burning to the ground, Jamal was facing his own absolute ruin. My husband had flown back to Atlanta on a separate commercial flight early that morning. He was desperate. He still believed he could somehow compartmentalize the damage and save his own career. He was an investment banker who handled millions of dollars for wealthy clients. He thought he could walk into his glass corner office and smooth things over with his senior partners. I thought his smooth-talking charm could fix federal espionage. He was completely delusional. When Jamal arrived at his downtown banking firm, his key card flashed red at the security turnstile. He tried to bypass the desk, but two armed corporate security guards immediately intercepted him. They did not call him sir. They did not offer him the respect he demanded from everyone around him. They escorted him straight to the Human Resources Department on the ground floor. His firm handled high-end net worth accounts and strictly regulated financial portfolios. The moment the news broke that one of their senior investment bankers was actively under investigation by the federal government for stealing classified military data, the executive board terminated his employment instantly. They could not risk the Securities and Exchange Commission auditing their entire firm because they employed a man involved in federal treason. Jamal begged them to listen. He tried to blame his father. He tried to blame Wyatt. He even tried to blame me, claiming I had set him up. But corporate executives do not care about family drama. They care about liability. And Jamal was the ultimate liability. They handed him a small cardboard box containing the few personal items from his desk. They stripped him of his company phone, his corporate credit cards, and his health insurance. Security marched him through the sleek glass lobby of the building he used to command and physically escorted him out onto the busy downtown sidewalk. My civilian attorney, Maxine, had moved with terrifying speed while Jamal was airborne before he even landed in Atlanta. Maxine had filed the divorce petition and executed emergency financial injunctions. Because I had documented his digital theft and his attempt to extort me with that pathetic post-nuptial agreement, the judge granted an immediate freeze on all joint accounts. Jamal could not touch a single cent of my military pay, my savings, or the equity in the home I had paid for. He had mocked my career, calling me a diversity hire and allowing his brother-in-law to degrade my service. Now my military income was the only clean money left in our marriage, and he was legally barred from accessing it. The irony was poetic. The very job he was embarrassed by was the exact thing that saved me from his financial ruin. Standing on that downtown sidewalk, Jamal pulled out his personal cell phone, the one he had used to coordinate the theft of my files. He had no office to return to and no gated compound to seek refuge in, since the federal agents were currently tearing his parents' estate apart, looking for hard drives. He was a ghost in his own city. The elite friends he had spent years buying expensive drinks for were actively ignoring his calls. The society he valued more than his own marriage had chewed him up and spit him out before lunchtime. I watched the notification come through my legal team confirming that Jamal's employment had been terminated. I felt a deep, profound sense of closure. I was standing on the concrete holding a cardboard box, completely stripped of his title, his wealth, and his fake prestige. I was a man who had sold his soul and betrayed his wife for a taste of ultimate power, and now he was entirely penniless. This was the cost of his arrogance. He had looked at a woman trained to calculate blast radiuses and survive hostile combat zones, and he had assumed I was weak enough to be manipulated. He assumed my silence was submission. He never understood that silence is just the space you create before you drop the payload. That silence was broken exactly 3 hours later. I was sitting at the metal desk in my temporary officer quarters reviewing tactical flight schedules when my secure mobile device began to vibrate continuously. The caller identification displayed a string of restricted numbers, but my security protocols easily bypassed the block. It was Jamal. I was calling from a prepaid burner phone because his corporate line had been seized and his personal devices were currently sitting in an evidence locker at a federal field office. I did not answer the phone. I let the device vibrate against the metal desk until the call went to voicemail. Less than a minute later, He called again. Then he called a third time. Over the next 2 hours, my husband left 14 separate voicemails. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat back in my chair, and played the first audio file on speakerphone. The voice coming through the speaker was completely unrecognizable. The smooth, arrogant investment banker who had confidently tried to gaslight me into a psychiatric facility just days prior was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified, sobbing man-child. Jamal was literally weeping into the receiver. His breath hitched and hitched as he begged me to answer the phone. He pleaded with me to call off the federal lawyers and stop the divorce proceedings. He sounded like a man drowning in a storm of his own making, desperately reaching for the very woman he had just tried to drown. I listened with cold clinical detachment as his tone shifted from begging to pathetic deflection. In the fourth voicemail, he stopped apologizing and started pointing fingers. He blamed the entire corporate espionage plot on his father. He claimed Harrison had relentlessly pressured him, manipulating his loyalty to save the family legacy from bankruptcy. He swore he never wanted to steal my classified files, but Harrison had convinced him it was the only way to protect their lifestyle. Then he turned his venom on Wyatt. Jamal sobbed into the phone, calling his brother-in-law an incompetent, clumsy fool who botched the digital download and tripped the security alarms. Jamal took absolutely zero accountability for his own treason. He was willing to throw his own father and his sister's husband directly under the bus if it meant saving his own skin. But it was the ninth voicemail that truly revealed the core of his betrayal. His voice dropped, losing the frantic panic for a moment of bitter, pathetic honesty. He actually tried to weaponize his own insecurity to make me feel guilty. He told me that my military career had emasculated him. He said I was too successful, too disciplined, and too independent. He claimed he only helped steal my logistics files because he wanted to feel like the powerful man in our marriage again. He wanted to secure that $40 million government contract so he could finally be the ultimate provider and put me in my proper place. He wanted to reduce me to a grateful, dependent wife. It was the most disgusting display of fragile male ego I had ever witnessed. He had committed a federal felony simply because his pride could not handle standing in the shadow of a successful black woman. I did not listen to the remaining 5 voicemails. I pressed the delete button and wiped the audio files completely from my device. I felt absolutely no obligation to absorb his emotional breakdown. When you actively attempt to destroy a person's life, you do not get to cry and demand sympathy when they survive and dismantle yours. I forwarded the call logs and the restricted numbers directly to my civilian attorney, Maxine. She moved with her usual lethal efficiency. Maxine filed an immediate violation of the temporary restraining order with the local authorities. Jamal received a visit from Atlanta law enforcement within the hour. The officers cornered him outside a cheap motel where he was hiding and delivered a very clear warning. One more unauthorized attempt to contact me. One more phone call or email would result in his immediate arrest and incarceration. He was forced into total absolute silence. He was locked out of my life permanently with no closure, no conversation, and zero forgiveness. The silence that followed in the coming weeks was profound. For the first time in 5 years, my environment was completely clear of their toxic noise. I did not have to listen to Vivian criticizing the sturdy pragmatism of my military uniform. I did not have to endure Aaliyah bragging about her fake country club status or her designer handbags. I did not have to shrink my intellect or hide my commendations to fit into Jamal's shallow, materialistic world. I spent my days at the naval base focusing entirely on my operational duties and my aviation training. I ate my meals in absolute peace. I slept soundly without the heavy, suffocating weight of their elite expectations crushing my spirit. While I was finding my peace and rebuilding my sanctuary, their world continued to burn to ash. Federal investigators officially indicted Harrison on multiple felony counts of conspiracy and defrauding the United States government. The federal banking authorities finalized the foreclosure on the sprawling Atlanta estate. Vivian and Harrison were forced to pack whatever personal clothing the government had not seized and vacate the premises. The great patriarch and his status-obsessed wife were reduced to renting a small, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely shunned by everyone they once knew. Aaliyah filed for a swift, highly publicized divorce from Wyatt, attempting to desperately distance herself from his crimes, but the social damage was permanent. She was a total pariah, but the wheels of military justice turned much faster and grind significantly finer than civilian courts. Exactly 3 weeks after the Washington gala, I was sitting in my secure office on the base reviewing tactical flight schedules. A sharp, heavy knock on my door broke my concentration. I authorized entry and the heavy oak door swung open. Two armed military police officers stood in the hallway, accompanied by a senior legal officer wearing the distinct insignia of the Judge Advocate General Corps. They did not look like men bringing casual news. They looked like men preparing a battlefield. The senior legal officer stepped forward and handed me a thick, sealed dossier bearing the official crest of the United States Navy. Wyatt had been formally charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He was facing a full general court-martial for unauthorized access to a restricted federal network theft of classified intelligence and conduct unbecoming an officer. The military prosecution team did not just want to rely on the digital tracking data and the metadata logs. They wanted to make an absolute spectacle of his treason. They wanted to ensure he was stripped of his rank and sent to a federal military prison for a very long time. The legal officer looked me dead in the eye and delivered the final directive. "You are officially subpoenaed, Commander. You are being called to the witness stand. The prosecution needs you to provide expert testimony regarding the digital breach and personally verify the exact classified nature of the files your brother-in-law attempted to steal. We are going to put you in the exact same room as the man who mocked your service, and we are going to let you testify to his absolute destruction." The heavy oak doors of the military courtroom swung open, and I stepped inside. The air in the room was sterile and aggressively air-conditioned, carrying the distinct weight of federal authority. A military tribunal is not like a civilian courtroom. There is no room for theatrical lawyers pacing the floor or emotional appeals to a sympathetic jury. It is a machine designed to weigh facts, evaluate conduct, and dispense absolute unyielding discipline. I walked down the center aisle, my dress whites perfectly pressed, my cover tucked precisely under my left arm. I took my seat in the gallery behind the prosecution table waiting to be called. I let my eyes scan the room, and they immediately locked onto the defense table. Wyatt was sitting there looking like an empty, hollow shell of a human being. The arrogant logistics lieutenant who had loudly bragged about his grueling deployments at my dining room table was entirely gone. He sat slumped and his shoulders hunched, his hands trembling as they rested on the polished wood. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes glued to the table, too ashamed and terrified to meet the gaze of the woman he had tried to destroy. The military judge called the court to order. The prosecution immediately called me to the witness stand. I stood up, squared my shoulders, and marched to the front of the room. I raised my right hand, swore the oath, and took my seat in the witness box. I did not feel an ounce of anxiety. I was in my element. The lead prosecutor approached the stand. He was a sharp, seasoned military lawyer who understood exactly how to dismantle a defense. He asked me to state my name, my rank, and my security clearance level for the official record. I stated them clearly, projecting my voice so every person in the courtroom could hear the absolute authority I carried. The prosecutor then moved directly into the events of the security breach. He asked me to explain the architecture of my restricted home office network. I answered with cold, clinical precision. I explained the biometric locks, the dual authentication firewalls, and the isolated server rack mounted beneath my desk. I explained how the system was designed to detect external hard drives and log every single keystroke. I did not mention my broken marriage or my former father-in-law. I spoke entirely in the language of cybersecurity and military protocol. The prosecutor brought up the digital logs on a large monitor facing the tribunal. He asked me to verify the access timestamps. I confirmed them all. I pointed out the exact moment the secondary motion sensors in my hallway were manually disabled. I identified the guest internet protocol address that had linked to my network. I confirmed that the physical machine identification number attached to the breach belonged directly to the personal laptop seized from Wyatt. Then the prosecutor asked me about the decoy file. He asked me to explain the tracking beacon I had embedded in the document. I detailed how the digital watermark functioned. I explained how the file silently pinged my secure server the moment it was copied onto Wyatt's external drive. I walked the tribunal through the entire digital trail, showing them exactly how the stolen file moved from my home to Wyatt's device and finally to the commercial servers of Harrison's defense firm. The evidence was absolute. It was a flawless, unbroken chain of digital custody, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Wyatt had committed espionage. The prosecution rested their direct examination. It was time for the cross-examination. Wyatt's defense attorney stood up and approached the podium. He was a civilian lawyer hired, presumably with whatever funds the family had left before their accounts were entirely frozen. He knew he could not beat the digital evidence, so he attempted the only strategy he had left. He tried to attack my character. He tried to paint me as a bitter, vindictive wife who had orchestrated a massive conspiracy to frame her innocent brother-in-law. "Commander," the defense attorney began, his tone dripping with fake sympathy, "you were experiencing severe marital difficulties at the time of this alleged breach. Were you not? In fact, you had just engaged in a highly emotional confrontation with my client at a family dinner the night before. Is it not true that you specifically engineered this entire situation to punish my client for a simple personal disagreement?" I looked at the defense attorney with absolute zero mercy. I did not raise my voice or show a single flash of anger. I let the silence stretch for a full 3 seconds, making him sweat under the gaze of the military tribunal. "I engineered a tracking beacon to protect classified federal intelligence," I replied, my voice completely steady. "My personal feelings regarding your client are entirely irrelevant to the functionality of a cybersecurity firewall." The defense attorney frowned, attempting to push harder, "But you placed a file on your desktop labeled as a defense strategy proposal. You knew my client would be in your home. You deliberately set a trap to entrap him because you were angry." I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the wooden rail of the witness stand. "I secured my network." I corrected him. "Your client made the deliberate conscious choice to bypass a physical biometric lock, enter a restricted area, plug in an unauthorized external drive, and steal military data. A trap only works if the target possesses the criminal intent to step into it. The data logs do not possess emotional bias, counselor. The metadata does not care about family dinners. The numbers simply reflect your client's treason." The defense attorney opened his mouth to argue, but he had nothing left to say. He looked at the massive screen displaying the undeniable digital footprints. He looked at the stern, unyielding faces of the military judges sitting on the tribunal. He swallowed hard, gathered his notes, and sat back down. The defense completely crumbled. I was dismissed from the witness stand. I walked back to my seat in the gallery, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of absolute justice settling over the room. The tribunal did not take long to deliberate. The evidence was too overwhelming, the breach too severe. When the judges returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere grew so tense it felt physically suffocating. Wyatt was ordered to stand and face the panel. His legs were shaking so badly, his defense attorney had to discreetly grip his elbow to keep him upright. The head of the tribunal read the verdict aloud. On the charge of unauthorized access to a restricted federal network, the tribunal finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of theft of classified government intelligence, the tribunal finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer of the United States Navy, the tribunal finds the defendant guilty. Wyatt let out a low, pathetic sob. His chest heaved as the reality of his destroyed life crashed down on him. The sentencing was delivered with brutal military efficiency. Wyatt was formally stripped of his rank. He was ordered to forfeit all military pay and allowances. He was handed a dishonorable discharge, permanently revoking all of his veteran benefits and branding him a traitor for the rest of his life. Finally, he was sentenced to serve 10 years in a federal military penitentiary. I watched as 2 armed military police officers stepped forward, placing their hands firmly on Wyatt's shoulders. They turned him around and marched him toward the side door of the courtroom. As he walked past the gallery rows, he finally looked up and made eye contact with me. His face was stained with tears, his eyes wide with profound regret and absolute terror. I did not blink. I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. I held his gaze until the heavy wooden doors closed behind him, locking him away in the dark. I was going to federal prison entirely alone. Aaliyah had not even bothered to attend the court-martial. The moment the scandal broke and the elite country club ostracized her, she immediately filed for divorce. She submitted the paperwork electronically and abandoned her husband to save her own fragile social status. She stripped his last name from her social media accounts and vanished, completely, severing ties with the man she used to parade around like a trophy. Wyatt had sacrificed his freedom to please a family that threw him away the second he became a liability. The courtroom slowly emptied. The prosecutors packed up their briefcases, and the tribunal judges retired to their chambers. I stood up, smoothed the front of my uniform jacket, and walked out into the wide, brightly lit hallway of the Military Justice Building. I felt incredibly light. The massive toxic anchor I had been carrying for 5 years was finally gone. But as I turned the corner, heading toward the main exit, I stopped. Standing near the glass double doors, looking like a shadow of his former self was Jamal. I was wearing a wrinkled gray suit that looked too big for his suddenly depleted frame. His eyes were bloodshot and his posture was completely defeated. He had lost his job, his wealth, his reputation, and his family empire. He was facing his own impending civilian trial for corporate espionage, and he was entirely out of options. When he saw me walking down the hallway, he pushed himself off the wall and took a hesitant step forward. He held up his hands, palms facing outward in a gesture of total surrender. "Kendra!" He called out, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, just give me 5 minutes. That is all I am asking for. Just 5 minutes of your time." I walked out of the heavy double doors of the military courtroom, leaving the sounds of Wyatt crying behind me. The wide corridor of the Military Justice Building was brightly lit and completely silent. The polished floors reflected the fluorescent lights overhead, creating a sterile and unforgiving environment. It was the perfect place for a final reckoning. I turned the corner heading toward the main exit and stopped. Standing near the glass doors, looking like a hollowed-out shadow of his former self was Jamal. My husband was leaning against the wall. He was wearing a wrinkled gray suit that hung loosely on his frame. The custom-tailored Italian wool now looked cheap and baggy. He looked like he had not slept or eaten in weeks. His usually immaculate haircut was unkempt, and the arrogant posture he had spent his entire adult life perfecting was entirely gone. He was a man who had lost his corner office, his luxury cars, his high society memberships, and his family empire. Hal was currently out on bail, facing his own impending civilian trial for corporate espionage, and he had absolutely nowhere left to go. The elite fraternity brothers and wealthy colleagues he used to host for expensive bourbon tastings had blocked his number the second the federal indictment hit the news. He was a complete ghost in his own city. When he saw me walking down the hallway, he pushed himself off the wall and took a hesitant step forward. He held up his hands with his palms facing outward in a gesture of total surrender. "Kendra!" He called out, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation. "Please just give me 5 minutes. That is all I am asking for. Just 5 minutes of your time." I did not break my stride until I was standing exactly 3 feet in front of him. I kept my hands clasped loosely behind my back, maintaining my strict military bearing. I did not look at him with anger or sadness. I looked at him the way you look at a math problem that has already been solved. "I have nothing left," Jamal said, his voice trembling as tears welled up in his bloodshot eyes. "They took the house. They took the cars. My firm blacklisted me from the entire financial sector. I cannot even get a job as a bank teller. My father is going to die in a federal penitentiary, and Aaliyah will not even answer my calls. I am completely ruined. Kendra, I have absolutely nothing." He reached out as if he wanted to touch my uniform sleeve, but my cold expression stopped him dead in his tracks. His hand dropped awkwardly back to his side. "How can you do this?" He sobbed, a single tear spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his cheek. "How can you just stand there and be so completely cold to me? I am your husband. We built a life together. We stood in front of our families and made vows to each other. How can you be so merciless to the man you loved?" I was still doing it, even now. Standing in the ruins of his own treason, he was trying to play the victim. He was trying to use the ghost of our marriage to manipulate my conscience. He wanted me to feel guilty for surviving his attempt to destroy me. I looked at the tears streaming down his face, and I felt a profound sense of clarity. The last lingering chain tying me to this man snapped completely. "You want to talk about mercy, Jamal?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "You want to talk about the vows we made in front of our community? You want to invoke the marriage you actively tried to sabotage?" He nodded frantically, wiping his face with the back of his hand, hoping he had finally found a crack in my armor. I did not give him an inch. "You did not love me, Jamal," I said, stating the absolute truth with lethal precision. "You loved the aesthetic of a successful wife. You loved showing up to the country club and the exclusive charity galas with an accomplished black woman on your arm because it made you look progressive and powerful. You loved the steady paycheck I brought home, and you loved the financial stability I provided while you leased sports cars you could not actually afford. You loved having a polished, intelligent woman standing quietly by your side to elevate your own status. You loved all of those things right up until my success threatened your fragile ego. The moment my military rank and my classified clearance made you feel small, You turned on me." Jamal opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off immediately, stepping 1 inch closer. "Do not dare interrupt me," I commanded. "You sat at your father's dining table and watched your brother-in-law degrade my military service. You watched him insult my honor, and you did absolutely nothing because you were terrified of your father. And when you realized my classified intelligence could save your family from bankruptcy, you did not hesitate to sell me out. You handed Wyatt the keys to my secure office. You bypassed our home security. You tried to steal my life's work." Jamal was shaking his head back and forth, weeping openly now in the bright hallway. "I was desperate," he pleaded. "My father told me we would lose everything. I just wanted to be the provider. I wanted to fix it. You wanted to destroy my sanity." I corrected him, my voice echoing slightly off the marble walls. "When I confronted you about the bank account, you tried to convince me I was losing my mind. You tried to blame my military service. You looked me in the eye and suggested I needed a psychiatric evaluation. You were willing to institutionalize your own wife just to cover up your theft. You were willing to let me lose my clearance, my career, and my freedom so you could play the big, successful businessman." I watched him crumble under the weight of his own actions. He sank to his knees right there on the polished floor of the Military Justice Building, the great investment banker, the man who used to sneer at anyone who did not wear a designer watch, was kneeling at the feet of the woman he had tried to erase. "You made your choice, Jamal." I continued looking down at him. "You chose to align yourself with a family of frauds who cared more about imported marble and designer gowns than basic human decency. You chose to let your mother treat me like a lower-class diversity quota. You chose to let your sister parade around like royalty while looking down on my service. You chose corporate espionage. You chose treason. I am not punishing you. I am simply the consequence of your own catastrophic arrogance. I am the mirror reflecting exactly what you are. Please, Kendra?" he begged, looking up at me with a wet, pathetic face. "I am terrified. I am going to prison. I do not know how to survive this. Please help me." I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I thought about the 5 years I had spent shrinking myself to fit into his shallow materialistic world. I thought about the times I had bitten my tongue to protect his pride. I had given him my absolute loyalty, and he had responded by trying to feed me to the wolves. I adjusted the cuffs of my dress whites, ensuring they were perfectly straight. "You should have thought about survival before you tried to ambush a combat aviator," I said. My voice completely devoid of emotion, I turned my back on him. I did not look back. I marched down the long, brightly lit hallway, the sound of my polished boots striking the floor, masking the sound of his quiet sobbing. I walked through the heavy glass double doors and stepped out into the crisp, fresh air of the afternoon. I left my husband kneeling alone in the sterile corridor, financially ruined, publicly shamed, and facing his own impending federal trial. He was entirely out of options and completely out of time. I had executed my defensive protocols flawlessly. The hostile threat was neutralized. My perimeter was secure. It was time to close this chapter and prepare for the next phase of my life. Exactly 30 days after I left Jamal, kneeling in that brightly lit military hallway, my divorce was completely and permanently finalized. My civilian attorney, Maxine, executed the final legal decrees with the ruthless precision of a guided missile. Because Jamal was facing a massive federal indictment for corporate espionage and attempted extortion, he had absolutely no leverage to contest a single clause of our separation agreement. His criminal defense lawyers had explicitly advised him to surrender immediately to all of my terms to avoid adding further financial fraud charges to his rapidly growing federal rap sheet. I sat in Maxine's sleek downtown office, looking out at the city skyline as I signed the final stack of thick paperwork. I kept 100% of my assets. I kept the modern home I had paid for with my own hard-earned money. I kept every single cent in my savings accounts, and my entire military pension remained completely untouched by his greedy hands. Jamal walked away from our 5-year marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes he had packed in a small cardboard box and a looming federal trial that would inevitably end in a lengthy prison sentence. The legal severing of our bond was absolute and total. I walked out of that law office and breathed in the crisp city air, feeling completely unburdened for the first time in half a decade. In the quiet weeks that followed, I spent a great deal of time reflecting on the concepts of family loyalty and the dangerous illusions of elitism. Jamal and his parents had built their entire existence on a foundation of shallow country club prestige. They worshipped imported luxury cars, custom designer gowns, and exclusive social memberships. They looked at me, a working-class black woman who chose public service and quiet dedication over corporate greed, and they assumed I was small. They assumed I was desperate for their validation. They thought they could diminish my intellect and mock my career simply because I did not fit their narrow, materialistic mold of what a successful black family should look like. They believed they could use my presence to make themselves look progressive and well-rounded, while secretly plotting to steal my life's work to save their failing financial empire. They wanted the aesthetic of a military officer in the family without showing any actual respect for the uniform I wore every day. What they failed to understand is that true power does not need to boast at a dinner table. True power does not need to belittle others to feel significant. They did not realize they were dealing with someone who had been rigorously trained to survive in the most hostile environments on Earth. They tried to ambush a combat officer in her own home. They tried to wage war against a woman whose daily routine involved calculating blast radiuses, anticipating enemy movements, and dismantling critical threats with absolute zero hesitation. I did not just survive their attempt to destroy me. I analyzed their weaknesses, isolated their vulnerabilities, and executed a flawless tactical strike that erased their entire legacy. They were the architects of their own destruction, and I simply handed them the tools to finish the job. Their desperate need to prove they were better than me was the exact blind spot I used to bring their entire empire crashing down to the ground. 6 months later, the air at the Naval Air Station was thick with the familiar, heavy smell of aviation fuel and the distant, powerful roar of turbine engines warming up on the flight line. It was precisely 0500 hours. The horizon was just beginning to glow with the deep, vibrant oranges and purples of early dawn pushing back the darkness of the long night. I stood on the edge of the sprawling concrete tarmac, letting the cool morning wind rush past my face. I reached down and slowly zipped up my olive green flight suit. The heavy fire-resistant fabric felt like a second skin. It felt like home. I looked out at the massive runway, watching the ground crews moving with synchronized purpose, holding their glowing orange wands and guiding billions of dollars of military hardware into position. The rising sun crested the horizon, hitting my face and warming my skin. The brilliant light washed away the last lingering shadows of the family that had tried to keep me trapped in the dark. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the clean, salty air blowing off the nearby coast. I picked up my flight helmet from the metal equipment bench. I ran my thumb over the bold black letters stankled across the smooth, curved surface. Eclipse, the name my arrogant brother-in-law had mocked, was the exact name that commanded absolute respect from the highest ranks of the United States military. It was a name earned through fire, discipline, and unwavering courage. I tucked the helmet securely under my right arm and began the long walk toward the flight line. My polished black boots struck the concrete with a steady, unwavering rhythm. Waiting for me at the end of the tarmac was a $60 million FA-18 fighter jet, its sleek gray wings angled sharply against the morning sky. It was a masterpiece of lethal engineering, and it was mine to command. I climbed the metal ladder, bolted to the side of the fuselage, and stepped over the canopy rail into the tight cockpit. I strapped myself into the ejection seat, locking the heavy restrictive harnesses tightly into place over my shoulders and chest. I flipped the battery switches, watching the digital displays illuminate the dark cockpit with a soft green glow. I pulled my helmet over my head, clicking the chin strap secure, and lowered my dark visor. I was not the broken, defeated wife they had tried to create. I was a weapon forged in absolute discipline and tested in actual combat. I gripped the flight controls, feeling the immense vibrating power of the twin engines humming powerfully beneath me, waiting to be unleashed. They had sat at a dining room table and demanded to know if I had ever been on a real mission. I pushed the throttle forward and steered my jet toward the active runway, completely ready for my next one. I felt the wheels leave the concrete and the heavy pressure of gravity pushing me back into my seat as the aircraft climbed violently into the clouds. Looking down at the earth shrinking beneath me, I knew I had left the wreckage of their lives far behind. The sky was clear, the coordinates were set, and there was nothing left but the endless blue horizon ahead. I am Maya, 35 years old, and until last night, my husband's elite family thought I was nothing but a glorified secretary. We were sitting at the mahogany dining table inside my in-laws' sprawling Atlanta estate when my white brother-in-law Wyatt smirked at me. "You are in the Navy?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Let me guess. Supply chain. I bet you have never been on a real mission." An older man, at the head of the table, my father-in-law, Harrison, looked up with a sneer. "What is your call sign?" he demanded, clearly expecting me to stutter. I looked him dead in the eye and gave him one single word: Eclipse. Before I tell you how that one word shattered his crystal wine glass and unraveled their entire fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to dismantle an arrogant bully using nothing but the cold, hard truth.